Ryan Decker didn't build the wind turbine for recognition or applause. He did it because no one else would. The tall, skeletal structure perched on the ridge above the county reservoir wasn't just a quirk of engineering. It was an answer to a quiet, recurring threat no one else seemed interested in addressing. For years, the rural county's emergency infrastructure had teetered on the edge of failure. Rolling blackouts during summer heat waves, ice storms in winter that left residents stranded, dispatch centers that lost radio contact at the worst possible times. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. And while local officials held meetings and wrote grant proposals that went nowhere, Ryan, a reserved, no-nonsense landowner with a background in agricultural systems, simply got to work. On a portion of inherited land that overlooked most of the valley, Ryan secured permits through a quiet agreement with a county supervisor who understood the stakes. No flashy headlines, no press coverage. Just a handshake and a file marked Disaster Infrastructure Secondary, a bureaucratic label that gave him the freedom to operate without interference. Over 18 months, Ryan designed and erected a high-capacity wind turbine capable of delivering power to key county facilities when the grid went down. It wasn't large-scale. It wasn't meant to replace the grid entirely. But it would buy time. Enough to keep the emergency call center online, run refrigeration for vital medications at the medical center, power a few water pumps to prevent a full collapse of pressure. That kind of time could mean the difference between a stable emergency response and total paralysis. He didn't talk about it much. People in the valley saw the turbine as an eyesore, something alien perched above their tidy fields and back porches. It made noise when the wind picked up, a low-frequency hum that blended with the rustling of the trees, but irritated those looking for absolute silence. A few neighbors made passive comments. Others filed vague complaints with the county claiming health effects and decreasing property values. Ryan ignored them. None of them had spent 3 days in the dark after a transformer blew in the middle of winter, watching the temperature drop below freezing in the home of a friend on oxygen support. He had. That memory was why he checked the turbine weekly, why he had it hardwired into a sealed substation, why he logged every rotation, every diagnostic beep, every surge. It was why he slept better when the wind blew at night. Not because of the sound, but because he knew the system would be ready if needed. Then came Karen. Karen Welton had moved in just under a year ago, buying a renovated farmhouse down the slope from Ryan's Ridge. She arrived with an overly enthusiastic Labrador, 2 decorative bird feeders, and a firm belief that every community should operate under rules of her own making. In the beginning, Ryan gave her the benefit of the doubt. She brought a tray of cookies to his door, introduced herself, and made pleasant enough small talk. But it didn't take long before the visits turned into complaints. The dog didn't like the noise the turbine made. Her niece, visiting for spring break, got a headache from looking at it for too long. Birds were avoiding her property because they thought the turbine was a predator. She insisted that it changed the air pressure near her garden. Ryan, as politely as he could, told her the turbine wasn't going anywhere. He offered to show her the permit papers. She declined. He offered to walk her through the emergency power system it supported. She laughed. That summer, Karen began showing up at county meetings. She never mentioned Ryan by name, but it wasn't subtle. She called the turbine a towering violation of natural peace and claimed it caused infralow vibrations that could trigger insomnia, migraines, and mood swings in humans and pets alike. She cited unverified blog posts and brought a pamphlet from a self-proclaimed environmental doctor. She waved a copy of a decades-old zoning map during one meeting and asked why the massive rotating structure wasn't subject to public vote. Most of the board didn't know what she was talking about. Ryan didn't attend. He didn't need to. The agreement was already filed, and his contact in the county office made sure it stayed that way. But Karen wasn't the type to drop things. She escalated. She took pictures from her porch and posted them online with captions like, "Industrial invasion in our backyard." She tried to start a petition, which got 6 signatures, 2 of which she later admitted were her own under different names. When she got no traction locally, she called a state environmental hotline and claimed a rogue wind installation was killing birds. That triggered a minor site inspection. A biologist came out, walked around, and left within an hour, reporting that no such hazard existed and that the turbine followed all environmental guidelines. Ryan received a letter confirming the inspection, a photocopied form with check marks in all the right places. He pinned it to his workshop wall with a thumbtack and forgot about it. Until the night it happened. Ryan had spent the day clearing fallen branches from the ridge path after a minor storm system passed through. The wind was steady, but not severe. That evening, the turbine was turning slowly, evenly, like always. He logged its readings. Optimal output, no fluctuations. He double-checked the anchoring bolts out of habit, then hiked down toward his home as the sky deepened into orange and gray. From his porch, the turbine looked almost serene, silhouetted against the sunset, its slow rotation like the heartbeat of something alive but distant. By morning, it was silent. Ryan noticed it before he reached the ridge. The familiar hum was gone, replaced by the thin whistle of wind through empty air. As he rounded the bend, the sight stopped him cold. The turbine's nacelle, the core structure that housed its gearbox and generator, was intact, but the blades were gone. Not broken, not scattered, gone. Cleanly severed, with scorched edges around the mounts. Someone had come in the night and cut them off. The reality of what he was seeing didn't settle at once. Ryan stood there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the ragged, burnt steel ends, as though staring would undo what had happened. Then instinct took over. He checked the gate lock, untouched. The perimeter tripwires, still armed. But the ridge had another access point, through a disused deer path down the slope. It would be easy enough to sneak up on the site from below if you knew what you were doing, or if you were simply persistent enough to try. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. This was sabotage. And Ryan didn't need to guess who had done it. What he didn't know, not yet, was how far the consequences would reach, or that within hours half the county would be plunged into silence, waiting for a backup power system that no longer existed. The first reports started trickling in just after 7 a.m., while Ryan was still standing beneath the mutilated turbine, his boots planted in gravel stained by rust and rain, his mind caught between disbelief and fury. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket with a notification from the county alert system. A terse line of text that read, "Power failure affecting municipal communications. All emergency dispatches on backup radio." A few minutes later, another alert arrived. Secondary station not responding. Diagnostic team en route. Ryan stared at the messages, then back at the gutted nacelle above him. The blades weren't just decoration or some green vanity project. They were essential. Without them, the turbine was a shell. It couldn't catch wind, couldn't turn the gears that fed voltage into the relay. And the secondary station, the one they were now reporting as non-responsive, wasn't a random hub. It was the same substation tied directly to his wind system, the one designed to carry power to the county dispatch center, to the water treatment plant on the southern edge of town, and to the emergency generator in the basement of the hospital. A cold understanding settled over him. This wasn't theoretical anymore. The sabotage had consequences, real ones that would unfold over the next several hours in ways he couldn't fully predict, but could already sense with uncomfortable clarity. Back at the house, Ryan switched on the emergency band radio mounted beneath his kitchen cabinet, a holdover from his days working with agricultural emergency services. The signal was weak, the station barely audible under static, but he caught enough to confirm what he feared. Operators were coordinating traffic control manually. Several roads near the county line were without signals. A dispatcher kept repeating a message on loop about the failure of backup power at the 911 coordination center. And then came the one that really made his stomach turn. A brief, crackling message from the hospital. Running critical systems only. Backup battery life estimated at 6 hours. Patient transfer in progress. He didn't need more detail. That hospital served over 30,000 people, and their generators weren't designed to run solo for more than a day. They'd held off relying on Ryan's turbine only because of bureaucratic inertia. No one wanted to officially depend on a private landowner's infrastructure. But, in practice, they had built the whole emergency response plan around that secondary line. And now it was gone. By 8:30, Ryan was back at the ridge with his field kit, taking photos of the damage. The blade stubs were scorched, not from the weather or wear, but from heat. Intense, directed heat, likely from an industrial-grade cutting torch. He found tiny flecks of metallic residue, scorched insulation fibers, and melted polycarbonate embedded in the gravel near the base. Someone had come prepared. This wasn't vandalism by bored kids or a random act of protest. It had taken planning, equipment, and a working knowledge of how the turbine functioned. He called the county emergency coordinator directly, skipping any hotline, and asked for an immediate site inspection. To his surprise, they didn't argue. Within an hour, a white van arrived, unmarked except for a county plate and the faint ghost of a removed decal. Out stepped 3 people, a grid specialist, an energy compliance officer, and someone from the local sheriff's department, though he didn't wear a uniform, just a badge clipped to his belt and a suspiciously clean pair of boots. Ryan explained what he'd found, showed them the photos, and pointed out the scorch marks. The sheriff's deputy took notes, though his questions were oddly nonspecific, as though trying to understand how much Ryan himself might have done. The energy compliance officer said little, but she examined the mount points with a practiced eye and muttered something about intentional compromise and deliberate disassembly. Then came the question Ryan knew was coming. The deputy turned to him and asked, "Do you have any reason to believe someone would want to interfere with this installation?" Ryan hesitated only a second. "You should talk to Karen Welton," he said. "She lives 2 properties down. She's been complaining about this turbine since the day it went up." They asked for specifics. He told them about her appearances at county meetings, her flyers, her online posts about electromagnetic poisoning, and her complaint to the environmental hotline. He didn't accuse her directly, not yet, but he laid out a timeline. The deputy nodded, as if this lined up with other information, and scribbled something on his notepad. It wasn't even noon before the situation escalated again. The hospital issued a formal request to the county board, citing emergency conditions and a failure of designated secondary support infrastructure. A local news station picked up the alert, and by early afternoon the story was circulating on regional media sites. They didn't mention Ryan by name, but the article included a photo of the turbine. From a low angle, its bladeless mast jutting into a cloudless sky. The headline read, "Critical Backup System. Sabotaged. County Scrambles to Respond." Ryan's phone lit up with calls and messages. Most were from people he hadn't heard from in months. Colleagues, suppliers, even 2 neighbors who had previously mocked the turbine's appearance. One message stood out. It was from a supervisor at the county emergency office, a terse typed request. "Please prepare a status report on your facility. County Legal will be in touch. Do not attempt repairs at this time." That last line made his jaw tighten. Someone was already maneuvering. Legal. The implication wasn't hard to read. Someone would try to shift blame. But Ryan wasn't panicked. Not yet. He was angry. He had done everything by the book. Every inspection passed, every protocol followed. If they wanted a paper trail, he'd give them one, down to the hour. Meanwhile, down the slope in her trim white house with the flower boxes and overfed golden retriever, Karen Welton was posting another video. This time, she wasn't complaining. She was celebrating. In the shaky footage, she stood in her backyard, framed by flowering shrubs, and gestured proudly to the empty sky behind her. "Do you hear that?" she asked the camera. "That's silence. That's the sound of peace finally restored to our community. No more clanking, no more whooshing, no more anxiety attacks triggered by that monster on the hill." She paused, smiled, then added, "I don't know who finally made the right call. Maybe someone brave, someone who understands what it means to protect a neighborhood. But whoever you are, thank you." The video had less than 100 views, but one of them came from an intern in the emergency coordinator's office, and another came from a technician at the sheriff's department who recognized the structure behind Karen's left shoulder, a metal workbench covered in tools, including, unmistakably, a portable cutting torch. By the end of the day, a formal investigation had been opened. Ryan didn't need to push for it. The machinery had already started turning, but damage had already been done, and the clock was still ticking on the hospital's backup batteries. He sat on his porch that evening, watching the clouds drift low over the ridge, windless and gray. In the distance, the bladeless mast stood like a broken antenna, hollow and useless. Somewhere in the valley, someone was fighting for their life in a flickering emergency room. Somewhere else, a dispatcher was scribbling down emergency calls by hand because the system wouldn't sync. And all of it because one person decided their discomfort was more important than the safety of 30,000 others. Ryan didn't believe in revenge, but he believed in accountability. And before this was over, someone would be held responsible. Not with internet shame or angry comments, but with real, tangible consequences. Because in the real world, damage wasn't measured in outrage. It was measured in outages. By the next morning, the incident was no longer just a regional concern. State Emergency Management had issued a secondary alert, this time indicating that cross-county mutual aid was being mobilized due to compromised critical infrastructure with suspected external interference. Ryan received a call at 6:42 a.m. from a voice he didn't recognize, someone from the governor's logistics team, asking for verification of his turbine's functional status and any recent modifications. The caller wasn't rude, but there was a chill in his tone, the kind of bureaucratic distance that told Ryan exactly what was being lined up: assessments, liability breakdowns, and potential culpability should the situation get worse. He calmly provided the technical details and informed the caller that the system had been forcibly disabled by an unauthorized party. The man on the other end asked if there was documentation to support that. Ryan said yes, there was, including site photos, timestamps, and an inspection report already filed with the county. The man made no comment beyond acknowledging receipt and ending the call with a practiced, emotionless, "Thank you, Mr. Decker." Meanwhile, down the ridge, Karen Welton's world was beginning to narrow. She hadn't noticed the police car that cruised past her driveway just before 7. She also hadn't seen the plainclothes officer walk the perimeter of her backyard while she was inside making breakfast. But she had noticed the neighbor across the street, Henry Cross, staring at her from behind his porch rail. Karen didn't like Henry much. He was old, slow-moving, and never smiled when she waved, but she considered that to be part of his general bitterness toward life. Today, however, there was something in his expression that made her stomach twist slightly. Not hostility, but wariness. She turned away from the window and reminded herself that she was on the right side of things. That turbine was a danger. She had said it from the beginning. It was only a matter of time before someone else saw it, too. She just happened to be the first to speak up. At 10:15 a.m., Karen received a knock on her door. Not a firm one, just 3 polite taps. She opened it to find 2 men in jackets. No visible weapons, no raised voices. One introduced himself as a representative from the sheriff's department, the other from the state fire marshal's office. They asked if she had a few minutes to talk about a developing incident involving local infrastructure. Karen, flustered but trying to maintain her composure, invited them in. She offered coffee. They declined. The questions began slowly. Did she know about the turbine on Mr. Decker's land? Yes, she did. Had she ever expressed concerns about it? Absolutely, she had every right to. Had she filed complaints? Of course, she had a folder. Would they like to see it? But then the questions shifted. Had she been near the structure recently? Had she visited the ridge in the last 72 hours? Had she noticed any unusual activity, perhaps at night? Had she used or owned any power tools suitable for cutting metal? Karen's answers grew shorter, defensive. She hadn't touched anything. She didn't even own power tools. The officers exchanged glances and politely asked if they could look at her garage. She refused, citing privacy. They nodded, thanked her for her time, and left without incident. But when she looked out her window 10 minutes later, a marked cruiser had joined the unmarked sedan at the base of her driveway. Her pulse quickened. She turned off the lights inside the house. At the ridge, Ryan had been instructed to stay off the tower itself, but he was allowed to supervise the forensic techs as they cataloged the damage. They worked methodically, brushing and bagging debris, dusting for fingerprints and analyzing the angle and depth of the cuts. The lead technician, a woman with a sun-scorched face and dirt under her nails, told Ryan in a low voice that the torch used was likely oxyacetylene, and based on the residue, the job had taken at least 20 minutes. That meant someone had spent a long time up there, either extremely confident they wouldn't be interrupted, or extremely desperate to complete the job. Ryan didn't comment. He was watching the tree line to the south, where an old footpath led toward a gully that connected with the edge of the Karen's property. It wasn't a direct route, but it was walkable, especially with a flashlight and gloves. News vans had started to appear by midday. They didn't come up the hill, but they loitered near the county road, hoping for a statement or a soundbite. Ryan avoided them, staying behind the marked perimeter. One of the deputies gave a generic statement. "We're conducting a thorough investigation in coordination with state resources." And that was enough to feed the headlines for another cycle. But the online noise had already grown teeth. Satellite images of the turbine had been unearthed. Old public records cited out of context, and blog commenters spun wild narratives. Corporate conspiracy, secret surveillance towers, even claims that Ryan was building an illegal military relay. The more grounded commenters, the ones who understood what critical infrastructure actually meant, were drowned out by hysteria and speculation. Ryan turned his phone off before reading too far. Later that afternoon, the county's risk management office issued a formal request for a full technical audit of all privately owned power systems connected to emergency protocols. Ryan knew what that meant. Every independent operator in the area, from solar farms to backup diesel tank holders, would now be pulled into the spotlight. What had once been a low-profile network of quietly maintained contingencies was about to be dragged into public scrutiny, and it started with him. That didn't concern him personally. His documentation was airtight, but he knew what it would mean for the county. Delays, review boards, and, most importantly, exposure of vulnerabilities. At 5:32 p.m., a new incident report came in. The water treatment station on the far side of the county lost pressure due to system lag. Without the turbine's voltage boost, the auxiliary pumps couldn't compensate during peak demand. For now, it was a boil order. Tomorrow, it could be worse. Back at home, Ryan sat at his desk going over the service contracts and maintenance logs for the turbine, double-checking everything he already knew was in order. The margins weren't for him. They were for whoever would try to twist the situation into negligence. The threat wasn't just from the person who cut the blades. It was from the aftermath. The blame, the deflection, the liability. He had prepared for technical failure. He hadn't prepared for political fallout. That's where the real damage was now forming, slow and unseen. And yet, in the chaos of the day, something strange began to shift. His neighbors, people who had long treated him with indifference or suspicion, started coming by. First, a wave from a truck, then a knock on the door, offers to help clean debris, questions about how the system worked. One man, a livestock owner from the western boundary, simply said, "Didn't think that thing mattered. Then the water cut off. Sorry, man. Should have backed you up sooner." Ryan said nothing to most of them, just nodded, but he felt it. The wind was turning. Not enough to lift the turbine, but enough to start a different kind of current. And down the ridge in her silent, shaded house, Karen Welton turned off her phone. She had seen the cruiser pull closer, had read enough online to know that her victory wasn't being received the way she had imagined. She told herself again that she hadn't broken any laws. That she was just trying to protect her neighborhood. That she hadn't touched a damn thing. But her hands were shaking. And from her backyard, across the quiet trees, the broken tower still stood, watching. The official summons arrived in a beige envelope with no return address, just a seal from the county attorney's office and Ryan's name typed in bold on the front. It wasn't unexpected, but still holding it in his hands made the weight of the entire ordeal settle differently in his chest. Inside was a formal notice, an invitation, as the language politely framed it, to provide a sworn statement regarding the events leading to the failure of critical county infrastructure. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the County Municipal Center. Attached was a checklist of documents and technical logs they expected him to bring. Ryan read through the list without reaction. He had everything already printed, logged, time-stamped, and stored in triplicate. That part didn't bother him. What did was the subtle shift in tone. The county wasn't asking what had happened. They were preparing to determine whether his system had failed them, or if someone else had. Meanwhile, Karen Welton had gone quiet. Too quiet. For someone who once couldn't stop airing her grievances about the wind turbine, her silence now felt unnatural. No more social media posts, no new complaints filed, no late-night calls to the community feedback line. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on her entirely. But the investigation was still very much alive. Ryan knew from a contact inside the sheriff's office, a former systems technician he'd worked with years ago, that the evidence collected from the ridge was damning. The scorch marks, the residual particulates from the torch, and a partial boot print found in the soil just off the lower ridge path all pointed toward a premeditated act of sabotage. They hadn't made an arrest yet, but it was clear a warrant was being prepared. The real pivot came late Wednesday evening, less than 12 hours before the hearing. Ryan was at home, packing his logbooks and maintenance forms into a battered aluminum case when his landline rang. He didn't usually answer unknown numbers, but something in his gut told him to pick up. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. Female, nervous, low. She introduced herself as Alyssa Heller, a technician from the County Utilities Division, and said she needed to speak to him privately, not officially, just off the record. She asked if he'd be willing to meet. When Ryan asked why, she simply said, "Because I think I've seen something that matters." He agreed, on the condition they meet in public. They chose a diner just outside the county line. Quiet, mostly empty, with a view of the highway and strong coffee. Alyssa arrived late, dressed in a service jacket and looking over her shoulder as she slid into the booth. She didn't waste time. She told Ryan that during an audit of internal emails related to the turbine project, she found a flagged message sent to the Environmental Compliance Office 3 days before the sabotage. It was from Karen. Not a formal complaint, Those were routine by now, but a strange, informal message marked confidential. In it, she asked whether removing the outer fan blades from a structure with unclear legal status could be considered a civic action under environmental protection statutes. The phrasing was deliberate, careful, but it betrayed intent. More disturbing was the fact that the email had been forwarded, not to the county sheriff or any legal authority, but to an outside address with no domain affiliation, just a name. M. Weaver. Alyssa had tried to track it, but it was scrubbed. She reported it to her supervisor, but the next morning, she was pulled from the audit team and reassigned to field operations without explanation. That's when she decided to speak to Ryan. She didn't bring proof, said she couldn't without breaching protocol, but she swore on her life that the message existed, that it had been seen, and that someone inside the county offices knew more than they were admitting. Ryan listened without interrupting. He didn't doubt her. He'd dealt with enough institutional inertia to know when something was being buried. But this wasn't just politics. If what she said was true, then Karen hadn't just acted alone. Someone else had helped her, maybe not physically, but by giving her cover, stalling the investigation or redirecting scrutiny. That changed the game entirely. The focus of the hearing would shift, the blame lines redrawn. Ryan thanked Alyssa and offered to pay for her coffee. She refused, eyes scanning the window behind him. When she left, she didn't say goodbye, just pulled her hood up and walked out into the parking lot, disappearing into the darkness like someone who already knew she'd said too much. The next morning, Ryan entered the county municipal center with a copy of every system report he'd ever filed. The conference room was stark. Plastic chairs, a long table, a digital recorder blinking on the corner. There were 6 people present. 2 county legal reps, a state auditor, the fire marshal, the infrastructure supervisor, and a silent man who didn't introduce himself but whose presence spoke of higher jurisdiction. They began with formalities, asked Ryan to state his name and occupation, and then launched into a series of structured questions. When did he last inspect the turbine? Who else had access? Was there a log of physical security breaches? Ryan answered with precision, without speculation. He made it clear that the system had operated flawlessly until the night in question. When they asked if he believed someone had sabotaged the structure, he said yes. When asked if he had reason to suspect a particular individual, he said he had submitted all prior complaints and public threats filed by Karen Welton, along with incident reports showing her history of targeting the project. The committee remained stone-faced. No one nodded, no one objected. They took his documents, asked for digital copies, and dismissed him with a short procedural phrase. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Decker." He didn't wait for their conclusions. He didn't need to. As he walked out of the building, past a local reporter shouting questions he had no intention of answering, Ryan understood something critical. This was no longer just about a wind turbine, or even about a county's emergency response system. It was about trust, in systems, in accountability, in the idea that preparedness matters more than politics. The system he built had failed, not because of technical oversight, but because someone decided their comfort mattered more than their community. And someone else, perhaps multiple someones, let that decision go unchecked. Ryan wasn't looking for vengeance. He was looking for resolution. And after what Alyssa had shared, he knew it wouldn't come through a single hearing or news cycle. It would take deeper digging, and not by him. This wasn't personal anymore. It was systemic. And it wasn't over. The week following the hearing unfolded like a slow-motion detonation, controlled from the outside but with internal tremors that shook through every part of Ryan's world. The initial assumption had been that the investigation would progress quietly, that the technical assessments and county legal responses would stay in-house, and that any punitive decisions would be handed down within a neat package of bureaucracy. That illusion shattered on Monday morning when the county council issued a public memorandum stating that maintenance irregularities and infrastructure oversight on Ryan Decker's property had directly contributed to a disruption in critical emergency services. It was worded carefully. No direct accusation of negligence, no legal terminology that would trigger a liability suit, but enough insinuation to paint a narrative. The kind that spreads faster than truth and sticks deeper than fact. Ryan read the statement twice, not out of disbelief, but to understand the framing. He had expected to be used as a scapegoat. He hadn't expected them to be so bold about it. The fallout came swiftly. First, the hospital formally severed its auxiliary agreement with Ryan's turbine, citing loss of redundancy confidence. That was bureaucratic speak for, "We can't risk relying on you again, even if we know it wasn't your fault." Then came a call from his insurance carrier requesting updated documentation of the system's physical state, as well as a notarized declaration that he would not attempt independent repair without third-party verification. Ryan asked if he was being investigated. The voice on the line hesitated, then replied, "We've been advised to monitor exposure." It wasn't an answer. It was a warning. By Wednesday, the local newspaper, once disinterested in anything outside zoning disputes and county fairs, ran a front-page story titled "System Failure or Sabotage. Community Divided Over Turbine Catastrophe." The article included a quote from Karen Welton. Somehow, despite the investigation, despite the recorded complaints and footage of her openly celebrating the turbine's destruction, she had managed to recast herself not as the antagonist, but as the concerned citizen. She claimed to have raised legitimate safety concerns about the turbine months before the event, and suggested that the system failed because it was built without proper oversight. The paper didn't include any mention of her history of harassment or the private video where she referred to the turbine as that mechanical parasite, or the way she once told a neighbor she'd sleep better once that wind demon was chopped down like a rotten tree. Instead, she was quoted as saying, "I wish I'd been taken more seriously before all this happened." Maybe none of it would have happened at all. Ryan didn't bother writing a rebuttal. He knew the game. The public didn't want facts. They wanted resolution that confirmed their worldview. Some rallied behind him, citing the turbine's previous life-saving function, pointing out that no failures had occurred before the blades were cut. But others, those who had always bristled at the sight of the structure on the ridge, found in this chaos a kind of retroactive vindication. They said the system was too reliant on one man. That real infrastructure should come from centralized sources. That personal systems created risk. In truth, what bothered them wasn't risk. It was inconvenience. The turbine was ugly. It made noise. And now that it was gone, they didn't have to look at it anymore. That Thursday, Ryan was served with a civil action notice. Karen was suing him. She wasn't suing for damages to her property or health. No, she was filing a community nuisance claim, stating that the turbine had violated environmental harmony, disrupted migratory bird patterns, and caused her emotional and psychological strain due to constant exposure to electromagnetic fields of an unknown nature. The suite named him personally and demanded not just a monetary settlement, but a permanent injunction preventing any future construction on his land that could be deemed visually or audibly invasive. The absurdity of it was infuriating. Karen wasn't just trying to avoid accountability. She was flipping the narrative entirely, casting herself as the injured party and using legal machinery to erase the evidence of what she'd done. Ryan contacted his attorney immediately, a seasoned municipal defense lawyer named Bram Keeler, who had handled more than one small-town legal firestorm. Bram wasn't shocked by the lawsuit, but he was troubled by its timing. "She's running offense," he said. She knows something's coming down the pipe and she's trying to muddy the waters, get you labeled as unstable before the charges hit her. Ryan asked what their options were. Bram was blunt. We can countersue for defamation, malicious prosecution, maybe even intentional infliction of emotional distress. But it won't stop the press. And it won't stop the people who already believe her. They agreed to file a motion to dismiss, but Bram cautioned that the case would likely be allowed to proceed at least to preliminary hearings. This is about headlines now, he said. She's buying time, not truth. In the background, the actual investigation was beginning to tighten. Ryan learned through indirect channels that a forensic analysis of the cut blades had matched scorch patterns consistent with a torch model sold exclusively at a hardware store 15 miles away. The store's security footage showed a woman purchasing that exact model 4 days before the sabotage, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, paying in cash. But the gait, height, and mannerisms bore a striking resemblance to Karen. It wasn't definitive, but it was strong enough that the sheriff's office had begun drafting a warrant. But something delayed them. A procedural snag. A missing witness. A jurisdictional handoff between the sheriff's department and the state investigative unit. Whatever the reason, days passed with no arrest. And, in that vacuum, Karen doubled down. She released a public statement through her attorney, declaring her commitment to preserving the peace and ecological integrity of our community, and warning that unchecked individual projects, however well-intentioned, pose systemic risks when allowed to operate without appropriate oversight. That was the final blow for Ryan's patience. He held a press conference, not in his defense, not to point fingers, but to correct the record. He stood outside the county council building, flanked by a small group of supporters, and read from a prepared statement. He detailed the turbine service history, the inspections it had passed, the emergencies it had mitigated. He provided a copy of the original county agreement authorizing the structure. He did not name Karen directly. Instead, he concluded with a simple line. This system was built to serve. It was destroyed by someone who did not understand it, did not ask about it, and did not care about its purpose. Let this be a lesson, not about technology, but about what happens when perception overrides responsibility. The crowd was small, the coverage moderate, but the message rippled. Online support began to shift. People who had once remained silent started to speak. Testimonials emerged from emergency responders who had relied on the turbine's backup voltage. A retired nurse posted about how her facility had stayed operational during a blackout thanks to Ryan's system. The tide wasn't turning completely, but it was eroding the platform Karen had built. Then, finally, the sheriff's office made its move. A warrant was executed at Karen's residence. The torch was found in her garage, hidden beneath a pile of garden equipment. Burn residue matched samples taken from the turbine base. More damning was a handwritten note found in a desk drawer detailing entry routes, cutting points, and a rough sketch of the turbine's mounting system. It wasn't just evidence. It was a blueprint for destruction. Karen was arrested the following morning. The charges were serious. Criminal mischief resulting in the disruption of public services, destruction of protected infrastructure, and obstruction of a government emergency system. She posted bail, but the illusion was broken. Her face appeared on the evening news, no longer framed by flower beds and dogs, but by flashing lights and a mugshot. She refused comment. Ryan didn't celebrate. There was no sense of victory. Just exhaustion, and the hollow relief that came from knowing the truth was finally louder than the lie. But the damage had been done. His reputation, though largely restored, bore the scars of doubt. The turbine, even if rebuilt, would take months to fully reintegrate into the grid. The county had begun discussions about whether to fund a separate, centralized emergency backup system, a project that would take years and millions of dollars. In the meantime, they asked Ryan if he would consider rebuilding. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. The trial was held in early spring, months after the dust had supposedly settled, though the fallout was still visible in every corner of the county. Water treatment stations had installed temporary diesel generators that coughed black smoke into the morning sky. Dispatch centers operated with redundant mobile units housed in trailers out back. And while emergency coverage was technically restored, everyone knew the county was still balancing on a thread. No one said it aloud, but they all thought it. If the turbine hadn't been sabotaged, none of this would have been necessary. But in a courtroom packed with reporters, legal aides, and a scattering of curious residents, the focus was not on systemic infrastructure, nor on the county's planning failures. It was on one woman and one action. Karen Welton arrived, flanked by attorneys, dressed in muted gray, her usual curated posture replaced by rigid composure. She didn't look at Ryan. She hadn't once since her arrest. Her lawyers had tried to negotiate a deal early on, plead guilty to minor vandalism, avoid jail time, pay restitution, but the state declined. Too much had been lost. Too many systems compromised. This was no longer a local matter. The charges carried weight now. They came with titles like interference with protected utilities and willful disruption of emergency infrastructure. The courtroom atmosphere was quiet but charged, the kind of tension born not from theatrics, but from the presence of real, undeniable stakes. Ryan sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table, not as a witness that day, but as an observer. His testimony had already been submitted. His technical logs entered into the record. He had no need to embellish, no desire to participate in spectacle, but he had come because it mattered, because seeing the conclusion with his own eyes meant everything after the months of disinformation, accusation, and legal maneuvering. The prosecution opened with surgical precision. They presented a timeline, maps, surveillance stills, and expert testimony. Forensic specialists explained how the turbine's mount points had been cut using specific equipment found on Karen's property. A metallurgy expert testified about the heat signatures consistent with an oxyacetylene torch. The digital trail, while thin, included her past communications, her public statements, and finally, the note discovered in her desk, an internal guide to an act she claimed never to have committed. Then came the recorded interviews, neighbors who had heard her express open hostility, former friends who described her descent from concerned resident into ideological crusader. The jury listened, quiet and grim. Karen's defense didn't deny her frustrations. Instead, they leaned hard into motive. They argued that she had acted out of concern, that she believed the turbine posed a threat to her health, to the environment, and that her actions, though ill-advised, were not malicious. Her attorneys painted her as misled, frightened, overwhelmed by the presence of a towering mechanical construct near her home. They claimed her intentions were to protest, to obstruct, to pressure officials into removing the structure, not to dismantle it herself. But no amount of reframing could explain away the torch, the notes, the timing, or the eerie absence of any other suspects. What finally broke the illusion, however, was a deposition from a county fire marshal. He explained that on the night the turbine failed, dispatch systems lost power for 18 minutes. During that window, a residential fire in a neighboring township went unreported until a passing vehicle spotted the smoke. The delay didn't kill anyone, but it had come close. A man with limited mobility had to be carried out by neighbors before the blaze spread. The room was silent as the details landed. No one needed to spell it out. If the turbine had functioned, the alert would have gone out immediately. The fire crews would have arrived sooner. The man's lungs wouldn't have filled with smoke. That testimony shifted the room. Karen's attorney objected to its inclusion, citing indirect causality. But the judge overruled him. Intent didn't shield consequence. That was the whole point. When Karen finally took the stand in her own defense, it was clear she had rehearsed her words. She spoke slowly, deliberately, never looking at Ryan, never straying from her script. She described the turbine as an imposition, an unknown, a violation of her sense of peace. She described sleepless nights, odd dreams, headaches, and the feeling of being watched by something inhuman. She admitted to hating it, but she denied ever touching it. Denied planning anything. Denied ownership of the torch, despite clear photographs showing her purchasing it. Denied writing the note, even when handwriting experts confirmed it matched samples from her previous filings. The prosecution didn't interrupt her. They didn't need to. Her own words unraveled her credibility far more effectively than cross-examination ever could. When the jury left to deliberate, Ryan stepped outside for air. The courthouse steps were covered in old pine needles and cigarette butts. The wind was picking up over the hills, the kind of steady breeze that once kept his turbine humming. He closed his eyes, listening, not for the sound of blades or gears, but for the nothing that had replaced them, for the vacuum she'd left behind. It took the jury less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing wasn't immediate, but the verdict itself echoed louder than any gavel. Karen Welton was escorted out of the courtroom without handcuffs, but without grace. She didn't cry, didn't scream, but the slight tremble in her posture spoke volumes. Her world, so carefully constructed around her own perception of righteousness, had collapsed. The consequences she'd thought she could outwit or delay had arrived. Afterward, reporters surged toward Ryan. He said nothing. Bram, his attorney, simply handed them a written statement. This case was never about conflict between neighbors. It was about responsibility, about understanding that actions, even when done under the illusion of good intent, must still answer to the harm they cause. The county, under quiet pressure from the state, began to backtrack on its earlier positions. The public memo blaming Ryan was scrubbed from their site. The hospital offered to re-establish auxiliary status once the turbine was repaired. The insurance company reinstated coverage under revised conditions. And in a closed-door session, a proposal was introduced to formally classify personal emergency systems as protected community infrastructure, immune to obstruction without state-level review. None of it felt like victory, because the truth was something had changed, not just in policy or perception, but in Ryan himself. He had built the turbine not to be noticed, not to be thanked, but to serve. He'd kept it operational through storms, droughts, and endless bureaucratic noise, and still it had been dismantled, not by a failure of engineering, but by the refusal of one person to accept what she didn't understand. That kind of damage doesn't heal with court rulings. It lingers. But in that lingering, there was something else too. Resolve. A kind of clarity that only comes when you've seen how thin the line is between public service and public sacrifice. He would rebuild, not out of pride, not out of defiance, but because the work mattered, because despite everything the wind still blew and someone still needed to catch it. The ridge was quiet again, though not in the way it had been after the blades were cut down. This time the silence carried purpose, weight, preparation. It had taken 4 months to begin reconstruction. Months spent filing revised permits, coordinating with engineers, and negotiating with the county still bruised by its own misjudgment. But the approvals came faster now. No one asked if Ryan's turbine was necessary. No one questioned its visibility or debated its aesthetics. Those conversations had ended the day Karen was sentenced to 16 months in a correctional facility and fined the full cost of damages, plus restitution to the county's emergency management department. There was no ceremony, no groundbreaking announcement. Just a delivery truck on the access road, crane arms lifting prefabricated blades into place, and workers installing hardware with silent precision. Ryan didn't supervise. Not directly. He trusted the new team, a private contractor referred by the state's Emergency Infrastructure Task Force, chosen not for politics but for their experience with off-grid recovery projects. They worked cleanly, efficiently, and without fanfare. Ryan watched from a distance most days, checking the progress against his own mental calculations, noting wind direction, torque calibration, grounding wire reinforcement. There was comfort in the details, in the knowledge that this time it wouldn't just be a private solution propping up a public system. It would be codified, protected, backed by law. What was once tolerated was now institutional. No longer a tolerated outlier, Ryan's turbine had become part of the official redundancy matrix for the county's disaster response network. Despite that, he remained removed from the spotlight. When the local news requested an interview about the rebuild, he declined. When the county offered to host a press event, he refused. Let it just work, he told them. That's all it ever needed to do. They respected that, mostly because they didn't want to reopen a story that had already embarrassed them. The county manager who once suggested Ryan had failed to maintain appropriate oversight had since resigned. A new board was in place, more careful, less combative, quietly eager to repair bridges rather than burn them. Karen's house, still standing but stripped of her presence, had been listed for sale by a third-party firm. No one wanted to mention it by name. It was the White House on the South Slope. Never Karen's house. The community wasn't cruel, just practical. They didn't like being reminded of their mistakes. A few neighbors privately apologized to Ryan, not for their silence, but for their assumptions. He accepted their words without resentment. Vindication didn't interest him. The work did. As the turbine neared full operational status, Ryan reconfigured his monitoring system. He upgraded the software, installed real-time diagnostics, and established an automatic reporting channel with the Emergency Command Center. This time there would be no ambiguity, no gaps in the record. Every rotation, every voltage spike, every emergency trigger would be documented and duplicated across 3 secured data centers. The turbine wouldn't just be functional. It would be inviolable, even if people chose not to see it. On a Friday evening in early summer, the blades turned for the first time since the incident. The wind was steady, clean, strong from the west. The nacelle rotated smoothly, the generator engaged, and the digital panel in Ryan's home office lit up with a clean, green signal. No alarms. No lag. The county relay picked up the transfer load within seconds. The test succeeded. No one applauded. No one needed to. That night, Ryan stood on his porch with a mug of black coffee and watched the lights across the valley. Some blinked, others glowed steady, a patchwork of households unaware they were once again being backed by a structure most had spent months debating, doubting, dismissing. He didn't feel anger, just clarity. Karen hadn't destroyed the system. She had tested it, and the county's ability to protect it. In the end, she hadn't broken the turbine. She'd hardened it. He thought about the man pulled from the burning house, about the seconds that had mattered, the breath that might not have come if others hadn't acted. That was the real reason he built the turbine. Not for recognition, not for control, but for time. Those fragile, irreplaceable moments between collapse and response. It had always been about buying time. And now, the system was ready again. In the window behind him, the monitoring panel pulsed quietly. The wind kept blowing, and this time, no one would dare stop it.